weeks, the headlines focused on one story: the airstrikes, the arrest, Maduro in handcuffs, oil reserves, legal debates about whether it was an invasion or law enforcement. But that phase is over. What we're watching now is something different, something that will matter far more than the drama of one Saturday morning in Caracas. Venezuela is no longer the headline. It's the case study. A case study for how the United States uses power, how China uses restraint, and how Latin America judges both. And here's what most analysts are missing. The operation handed China a propaganda victory. China calls for law and dialogue, while the United States bombs neighbors and threatens the region. Venezuela wasn't the crisis. It was the test run, and the world graded it. Today, I'm going to show you what's actually changing, not just what happened in Venezuela, but how that operation shifted perceptions across Latin America, strengthened China's diplomatic position, and revealed a fundamental change in how American power operates. This is about structure, about credibility, about what happens when coercion replaces persuasion as the primary tool of influence. Let me walk you through what's unfolding, what actually changed this week. First, let's establish how the story moved, from event to structure, from shock to legal process to international response. Power in Venezuela is being formalized through U.S. courts. Maduro faces federal charges in New York. That pulls the entire situation into American judicial machinery, creating legal frameworks that will shape what happens next. But the international reaction is what changed the dynamic. This isn't just condemnation from a few countries anymore. It's a regional response, a bloc response. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, Uruguay issued a joint statement condemning the operation. Not individual statements, joint. That's significant because it shows coordination. It shows that Latin American governments see this as a shared threat, not just Venezuela's problem. And the United Nations system is now under strain. Multiple countries have accused the United States of kidnapping a head of state, conducting regime change without Security Council authorization, and violating the UN Charter's prohibition on using force against sovereign nations. The UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela stated that alleged violations by Maduro's government do not justify military intervention that breaches international law. So the issue shifted from, was this legal under U.S. law, to, does international law mean anything when a major power decides to ignore it? And that question has implications far beyond Venezuela. The new tool of American power. Let's be clear about what's happening structurally. For decades, American influence rested on alliances, institutions, and economic integration. Countries wanted to be part of the U.S.-led system because it offered stability, growth, and predictable rules. That foundation is eroding, and what's replacing it is economic coercion backed by the threat of force. The United States now relies heavily on sanctions, courts, asset seizures, energy choke points, and control over financial infrastructure. According to 2024 data, 60% of low-income countries are under some form of U.S. financial sanction. The U.S. imposes 3 times as many sanctions as any other country or international body. This isn't coalition building. This is pressure application. If you don't comply, you're cut off from dollar-based financial systems. If you try to bypass those systems, you face secondary sanctions that punish anyone who does business with you. And now, as Venezuela demonstrates, if economic pressure doesn't work, military force becomes the next option. But here's the problem. To much of the world, this doesn't look like leadership. It looks like coercion. It looks like threats rather than partnerships. And that changes how countries calculate their interests. Because if working with the United States means you might be the next target when policy priorities shift, why would you tie your economy to American systems? This is the strategic contradiction. The more the U.S. uses economic pressure and military force to maintain dominance, the more incentive other countries have to reduce their dependence on U.S.-controlled systems. The China effect, how America lost the optics war. And this is where China enters the story. Not through military action, not through threats, through positioning. China won a propaganda victory without firing a shot. Beijing framed itself as the defender of sovereignty and international law. It condemned the U.S. operation as a violation of the UN Charter. It called for dialogue and respect for Venezuela's right to resolve its internal affairs without external interference. And here's the key part. That message resonated across Latin America because what Latin American countries saw was this. China builds infrastructure in their countries. The United States bombs their neighbors. China offers loans and trade deals. The United States threatens tariffs and sanctions. This isn't about morality. China's government has its own record of coercion and control. But in this specific contest, in this specific region, China positioned itself as the stable partner, while the United States looked unpredictable and aggressive. Brazil's President Lula said the operation was, quote, a grave affront to sovereignty and an extremely dangerous precedent. Colombia's President Petro condemned the strikes and said conflicts should be resolved by people themselves in peace. Mexico called it a clear violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. These are major regional powers, and they're not just criticizing the operation. They're signaling that they see the United States as a less reliable partner than they thought. We tried to scare China. We ended up advertising for China because every country in the global south is watching and asking, if the United States can do this to Venezuela, what stops them from doing it to us if we make decisions Washington doesn't like? Latin America, from partners to skeptics. Now let's talk about what this means for the hemisphere. Because the Venezuela operation didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern of threats and pressure directed at multiple countries. Trump's administration has publicly threatened or pressured Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, and Panama. Colombia over migration policy, Mexico over trade and border security, Cuba, as always, Panama over the canal. And Venezuela is the proof that these aren't just rhetorical threats. They can escalate to military action. So Latin American governments are recalculating. For decades, the default assumption was that aligning with the United States offered economic benefits and security guarantees. Now that assumption is being questioned. Countries are now choosing between two models: predictable Chinese economics, loans, infrastructure investment, trade deals with clear terms, versus unpredictable American power that can shift based on domestic politics, social media posts, and sudden policy changes. China offers long-term contracts and doesn't care about your internal governance. The United States offers access to the world's largest economy, but demands alignment on foreign policy, trade rules, and increasingly political decisions. For many countries, especially those that have been on the receiving end of U.S. pressure, the Chinese model is starting to look more attractive. Not because China is morally superior, but because it's more predictable. And that shift from seeing the U.S. as the natural partner to seeing China as a viable alternative, that's a strategic loss that will take years to reverse. The oil story with new context. Let's bring this back to oil, because oil is still central to understanding why Venezuela matters. Venezuela has 300 billion barrels of proven reserves, the largest in the world. But production collapsed under Maduro. Infrastructure decayed. Output fell from over 3 million barrels per day to less than 1 million. So why does this matter strategically if Venezuela isn't producing much oil? Because it's not about current production. It's about future control and currency denomination. For 50 years, global oil has been priced primarily in U.S. dollars. That creates automatic demand for American currency. Every country that needs oil needs dollars. That demand allows the United States to borrow cheaply and finance deficits that would be unsustainable otherwise. But that system is fracturing. BRICS nations are increasingly settling energy trades in local currencies. Saudi Arabia refused to renew its exclusive dollar agreement. And Venezuela, under Maduro, was selling oil to China in yuan, settled through Chinese payment systems. If Venezuela, sitting on the world's largest reserves, proves you can price oil outside the dollar and survive, other countries will follow. That's the threat. Not that Venezuela would sell 1 million barrels a day to China, but that Venezuela would demonstrate an alternative system works. So the U.S. removed the government. The goal is to bring Venezuelan oil back into dollar-denominated trade, prevent China from securing an independent supply, and maintain control over global energy pricing. But here's the irony. China builds infrastructure in Venezuela. The United States bombs it. China offers stability. The United States creates crises. And from the perspective of oil-producing nations watching this, the message is clear. Selling to China might be safer than selling to the United States, because China won't invade you if you change suppliers. This is the strategic contradiction. The operation might secure short-term control over Venezuelan oil, but it accelerates the long-term trend toward non-dollar energy systems. International law and the UN, the credibility collapse. Now let's talk about the legal and institutional damage. Under the UN Charter, military force against another state without Security Council authorization or an imminent threat is prohibited. This is foundational. This is the principle that supposedly prevents great powers from invading weaker neighbors. The United States violated that principle. And when confronted, the response was essentially, so what? Multiple countries pointed out that this looks exactly like the kind of unilateral aggression the U.S. criticizes when Russia or China does it. The hypocrisy is obvious, and it undermines every argument the United States makes about rules-based order. Because if rules only apply when convenient, they're not rules, they're preferences. And preferences backed by power are just coercion. This isn't the first time the United States supported a coup attempt against Hugo Chavez in 2002. It's been pursuing regime change in Venezuela for over 20 years through sanctions, political pressure, and support for opposition movements. But this operation was different. This was direct military action. This was airstrikes on a capital city. This was the removal of a sitting head of state by force. And that sets a precedent. If the United States can do this without consequences, what stops other powerful nations from doing the same? Why should China respect Taiwan's sovereignty? Why should Russia respect Ukraine's borders? The answer before was because international law prohibits it. But if international law doesn't constrain the United States, why should it constrain anyone else? This is the credibility collapse. And it's not just legal, it's institutional. The UN system depends on great powers at least pretending to respect the rules. When they openly disregard them, the system loses legitimacy. And once legitimacy is gone, all that's left is power. And power alone is a brittle foundation for global order. The military-industrial momentum. Here's a dimension that doesn't get discussed enough. These decisions aren't necessarily reflecting the will of the American people. They're reflecting the momentum of institutions that benefit from conflict and instability. President Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex in 1961. He said the influence of that complex was economic, political, and even spiritual, felt in every city and state house and office of federal government. That warning is more relevant today than ever. Policy is increasingly driven not by democratic debate or voter preferences, but by a security establishment that operates with minimal oversight, enormous budgets, and institutional interests that favor action over restraint. Congress wasn't consulted before the Venezuela operation. The Gang of Eight, congressional leaders who are supposed to be briefed on sensitive operations, were informed after the strikes had already begun. Executive orders and emergency authorities have expanded presidential power to the point where military action can be initiated without meaningful legislative check. This isn't about one administration. This is about a structural shift where the executive branch, backed by intelligence agencies and defense contractors, can conduct operations that reshape foreign relations without democratic accountability. And the cost of that shift shows up in ways that aren't always visible, in strained alliances, in countries hedging against American unpredictability, in the erosion of soft power and diplomatic credibility.